Today is again March 28th, 2020, and this is the coronavirus pandemic Terminator series. And this is video 3, and we are going to start from slide 11. So we had talked about the evolutionary thought processes. So some of the thought processes that evolve continue useless thoughts in any culture, and as a matter of fact, all the cultures of the world. And those useless thoughts sometimes suppress the learned wisdom or forget the learned wisdom of a particular culture, and sometimes that wisdom is crowded out for a multitude of reasons. And the same phenomena also happens in evolution. So whenever in evolution a new particular mutation is formed, a new advantage is gained by a virus, a bacteria, or an organism, that advantage obviously crowds out the other disadvantages, mutations that had some advantage in the past. And in humans, there is an organ in the gastrointestinal tract, or an appendage in the gastrointestinal tract called appendix. And that appendix is just a outgrowth or a finger-shaped, hollow, tube-like structure that grows out of the terminal ileum, between the junction of the terminal ileum and the colon. And that appendix in the distant past had an advantage for the mammals, to help them digest cellulose or grass, which was undigestible, and it had particular advantage in horses. However, since we all share a common ancestral evolutionary tree, that advantage was no longer necessary in humans, but the appendix still hangs around us. Appendix in our normal life serves absolutely no useful purpose. The only useful role it serves is occasionally it gets obstructed by fecal material or fecalates or hard material in the stool, or occasionally for other reasons it gets either inflamed or infected, and it can occasionally rupture. When it becomes inflamed, infected, or gets ruptured, it needs removal, otherwise there is almost certain death. So you can see something that has no useful role persists in human beings and can be hugely damaging, but the evolutionary process just keeps reproducing us humans with the appendix with us, even though it no longer has any useful role. And evolutionary forces that shape these kind of appendages like appendix never ever hold an international or a universal conference or a convention where the decisions are made that let's go ahead, phase out appendix now, and we will no longer produce human beings with appendix in there. So this erroneous, useless baggage is continued from one generation to the other. Now, the appendix is a part of biology, but the same thought processes that produce our cultural wisdom also sometimes carry cultural baggage that no longer serves any useful role, and sometimes it develops scientific blind spots, and that's what we are going to focus on. And in those evolutionary thought processes, the prevailing wisdom on any topic or just about any topic sometimes can have built-in scientific blind spots or flaws in our thinking. And those scientific flaws are becoming more and more obvious in light of this coronavirus pandemic. And just like the evolution or evolutionary forces never hold any international or universal convention to phase out these useless appendages like appendix, same way the cultures, most cultures do not hold any international annual conventions or universal conventions where there are virologists, epidemiologists, microbiologists, politicians, industry leaders, doctors, scientists who sit together and plan on how to get rid of useless evolutionary thoughts. So these useless evolutionary thoughts, sometimes outdated thoughts, thought processes just continues in our culture. And along with that thought processes, the brain itself has a limitation. Our brain is only capable of processing somewhere from 400 to 2000 bytes of information. The bytes are again the same terminology. Those are used in computer science or in RAM, in random access memory. So our brain is really only capable of processing the prefrontal cortex, or the front part of the conscious part of the brain can only process somewhere from 400 to 2000 bytes of information, depends on which neuroscientist calculates that capability. So we can use an average term of 1000 bytes per information. So that's the conscious part of the brain that can process only about 1000 bytes of information. However, the unconscious part is continuously processing 4 billion bits of information subconsciously. So for example, right now, as I'm sitting and talking to you, my brain is making sure that my pinky toe and my big toe on my right foot are not producing any brain signals. If this particular information came to the conscious part of my brain, I obviously would not be able to give you this presentation. So those are the parts of the subconscious part of the brain. And the subconscious part of the brain clearly has so much more voluminous information. It can very easily overwhelm the conscious part of the brain, which only can process 400 to 2000 bytes of information. So those are some of the built-in flaws in human brain. And then the human brain continuously suffers from continuous overload of information. So it has to prioritize which information should be prioritized in the conscious part of the brain. So as a result, there are multiple tricks or processes used by the brain to prioritize that limited capability. And one of that is called the social networking of information. Most of our human brains cannot know all the information of the world or the wisdom of the world. And no one human being can read all the information on every website that Google presents to you. So what we use is something called social networking of information. So for example, I as a physician know a reasonable amount of microbiology, virology, infectious disease, surgical techniques, internal medicine techniques, physiology, neuroscience, neurology, psychiatry, but I'm not particularly like a virologist, have spent all my adult life studying viruses also. And then even among the viruses, there are virologists who specialize in RNA viruses, DNA viruses, tropical viruses, and so on and so forth. So you can see that this particular process of social networking of information provides a lot of advantage, that there are people who specialize in one particular field of information. But the downside of that is that information is very difficult to flow to the general aspects of a culture or information sharing, and some of that information remains obscure and in the background, and when necessary is not always easily accessible. And we all make this assumption that there are some experts out there who must meet on an annual basis in a national convention center somewhere and update and synchronize their brains, and are going to synchronize our brains, everybody's brains with the latest in science and medicine. Now that's a wonderful assumption, but it's unfortunately completely flawed and completely wrong. And I'll go over some of the flaws of that thinking and how it can predispose us to providing suboptimal personal protective equipment in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic to healthcare workers, but also to the general public. And this social networking model is rather effective in some aspects. This makes the model of information processing extremely efficient. But until one realizes that it has huge built-in flaws, we are living through them. this can also expose us to the limitations of social networking model of information processing. And each culture eventually has to decide which evolutionary cultural baggage is important to shed and which one is important to maintain. So not only do we accumulate cultural wisdom, then somewhere along the line we have to decide which cultural wisdom serves a useful role and which one no longer serves a useful role. And whenever those decisions are made, usually people with money and power always get a seat at the table where such important societal decisions are being made. And in the early 20th century, uh, when the decisions were made whether we should lock the whole human society in a fossil fuel or not, guess what? Who made those decisions? The fossil fuel industries made those decisions. And once a human society is locked into these kind of decisions, you can see that it's almost been over 120 years and we are still locked in fossil fuel destiny, and you can see the flaws with that. And how long after we learn to manage significant energy needs with renewables? For example, we have been able to produce renewable energies for about 50 years, but we still are not able to shake off our reliance on the fossil fuels. And based on those flawed thinking, we have to ask how much are we willing to tolerate? How much warmer do we want the planet to get? And this, again, video has gone to about 13 minutes. So I'm going to pause over here, and then we'll pick up in our next video with slide number 14. So I'm going to pause here and we'll pick it up again with slide number 14.